Hi, I'm a volunteer from Syrian ICE, a grassroots level initiative working in refugee camps and marginalized communities in Lebanon. We are currently collecting money to provide urgently needed hygiene kits to families in the settlements to prevent an outbreak of the coronavirus. Most families in the settlements have been affected by the curfew and lost their income. They don't have the possibility to socially distance. They cannot afford the gloves, masks, or even soap to prevent the potential spread of the virus. The hygiene kits we plan to distribute contain soap, gloves, masks, and other hygiene products, which would last for a month for an entire family. We also continue to cover medical expenses for urgent cases and chronic illnesses unrelated to the COVID 19 pandemic, but still in need for attention and support. You can find our campaign on Go Get Funding and on our Syrian ICE Facebook page, and we are grateful for any kind of support.
So this is a conversation with Kareem Shaheen. He's the former Beirut and Istanbul-based correspondent for Turkey and the Middle East for the Guardian newspaper. He's a current analyst on the region as well as a writer for the satirical Arabic news publication Al-Hudood. We spoke about the importance of journalism, given the lack of justice and accountability in Syria, the Middle East and beyond, that should, in more ideal settings, come out of the kind of investigative and critical journalism that he does. We also spoke about his visit to Khan Sheykoun 2 days after the Assad regime's 2017 chemical attack on the town, as well as his reflections on what he called this nightmare decade for the Arab and Muslim worlds. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FireTheseTimes and on Instagram at TheFireTheseTimes, and you can also support it on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, the links to which are in the description. Thank you for your time.
My name is Kareem Shaheen. I'm a journalist and columnist based in Montreal. I used to be the Guardian's Middle East correspondent based out of Beirut and then Istanbul. And right now I write analysis and columns about the Middle East and I write satire for Al-Hudood, which is an Arabic satirical news website.
Awesome. Thanks for having this chat with me. We'll start with, unfortunately, I think probably the heaviest part of this conversation. So almost exactly 3 years ago, as a Guardian correspondent, as you mentioned, you went to Khan Sheykoun in Syria. I believe it was a couple of days after the Assad regime's chemical attack on the town. And I'm asking this first, I'm really sorry. I'm sure this is not easy to talk about. But I'm asking you this question just because a few days ago, the OPCW, which is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, finally assigned blame on the Assad regime, I think for the first time officially, for dropping sarin gas on the nearby town of El-Tamine, if I'm not mistaken, which happened maybe a week before or something like that. In response to the OPCW announcement, The Observer, which is the Guardian sister paper, released an editorial saying that this brought another forceful reminder of why the world must not concede the victory Assad craves. So my question to you, and here please answer however you feel most comfortable. Can you talk a bit about your visit to Khan Sheykoun after the attack and maybe your reactions to the OPCW report, and if you how do you feel its significance might weigh in the future?
Sure. Well, let's start with the last question. Obviously, it's really important that the OPCW has produce these reports because they delve into really great detail about the chemical attacks that took place. Not the Khan Sheykoun one, but the other ones, the Latamne ones that you mentioned happened a few days before the Khan Sheykoun attack. And their mandate includes, I think, 30 other chemical attacks in Syria. And so it's going to be really important to follow the release of these reports, to see what they have to say, to delve into the intricate detail that they went into when trying to identify the perpetrators of these attacks. I think it's a really important step because it does lay out in almost unprecedented detail the facts behind some of the worst atrocities in 9 years of warfare. For better or for worse, the international community has decided that chemical attacks are, the signifier of brutality in the Syrian war, even though, they've claimed a relatively small percentage of victims compared to all the other methods of torture and death that have been visited upon Syrians, whether it's starvation sieges, whether it's barrel bombs, whether it's, every kind of weaponry that's been deployed against them throughout the war. This evidence is built in such a way that it could lay the groundwork potentially in the future for trials. It even identifies specific officials who were involved in orchestrating these chemical attacks, even if their names are redacted in the public versions of the reports. And so this evidence is really important in the future if the political will is changed sufficiently enough to actually lead to trials and to some form of justice for the Syrians who died as a consequence of chemical attacks or more broadly in the violence that has taken place during the war. And I think it's a really important step for accountability and attributing responsibility. Now, obviously, this report by itself is not sufficient because it does not mean that the perpetrators will be held to account or will face justice. But it is a really important first step, and ultimately it's going to be up to the international community in the coming years to determine what to do with that information, particularly as it comes, as it goes on, as the OPCW goes on releasing more of these reports. I'll talk for a bit about the visit to Khan Sheykoun, and if you have any specific questions about it, I'd be happy to answer them. Like you said, the visit occurred a couple of days after the attack itself happened. When the attack happened, there was a call out, from Ahrar al-Sham, which at the time was one of the main militias in charge or in control of most of the opposition areas in Syria's northwest in Idlib province where the attack took place. And they said that they would protect any foreign correspondents who choose to come to Khan Sheykoun to visit the site of the attack. And so that's what I did. I flew down to Antakya near the Syrian border the same night that the attack happened. And the next day we crossed into Syria. And the following morning, drove down to Khan Sheykoun, along, with the protection of the militia. And I arrived there and went straight to the site of the attack itself, and documented some of that visit, with video footage and with interviews. I was trying to reconstruct exactly what had happened 2 days earlier when the attack occurred. And so, as you know, in the immediate aftermath of the attack, there were a lot of stories and disinformation that was coming out about what had actually happened. And, the Russians had said that a chemical warehouse had been bombed that contained chemical weapons and stockpiles that belonged to the opposition. The Syrian regime had its own story, which changed over the course of the day as it became clear that there were going to be some international consequences to what had happened. And so our main aim was to go there and try to reconstruct what had happened and to establish the truth behind the allegations that were being made and whether there was any truth to the Russian claims, and to investigate exactly what had happened. And so through interviews with first responders, with locals who were in the area, visits to the local hospital, a visit to the local hospital which had been bombed in the immediate aftermath of the chemical attack as it was receiving victims. And I also went to visit the home of a man called Abdelhamid Yusuf, who had lost his 2 children and his wife in the attack the day before, along with more than a dozen other members of his extended family. And I spent some time with him. I don't think interview would be the right word for our conversation. He was obviously in shock and kind of drifting in and out of what was happening around him. There was a memorial service for his family that we visited, and I was able to speak to some of his relatives and other members of the family who were there or who had been affected by the attack, including a cousin who had survived it but was still in some pain and illness. Afterwards, I went and visited the graveyard where his family was buried, and spent some time there to pay my respects to them, to say a small prayer, and then we drove back to the border, and I wrote my story.
Okay. You mentioned disinformation. I would assume, I think that most of the listeners would have some idea of what you're talking about, the disinformation campaigns by the Syrian regime and the Russian government. But would you mind expanding a bit on this, maybe using Khan Sheykoun as an example, or maybe not, as you wish, about what that actually looks like, and how yourself as a journalist, how have you tried to address that different dimension? Because in some ways it's become a primary asset of both the Syrian regime and the Russian government when it comes to the war in Syria.
Sure. I mean, the Syrian war has this dichotomy, which is the fact that it's the most well-documented war in history, because of the availability of so much video and footage and reporting on every minutia, on all the minutia that occurred during the war, from the individual sort of military movements and developments to the bigger overarching themes of the war. And then the other aspect of that dichotomy is the fact that very few journalists have access to what's happening on the ground, for various reasons. Obviously, the areas under rebel control were sometimes under the control of extremist groups, and the risk of kidnapping was quite high in some of those areas. There are restrictions on movements across borders, whether it's from Turkey or from Lebanon. If you want to go report on what's going on in government-held areas, you need to get an approved visa by the government, and then have a minder sort of follow you around as you interview people. So there were a lot of difficulties in having journalists be able to do their jobs the way they ordinarily would, which is to go visit the location and report on what's happening based on their eyewitness testimony, their own eyewitness testimony, as opposed to that of others. And and this was obviously made it fertile ground for the spread of disinformation, for the spread of various lies and faulty information that has been going on regarding pretty much every single aspect of the war, from from its early years and its formative events to the major events that happened later on, like Russia's intervention in the conflict and the rationale behind it, and even who the sides fighting on either side are and what they believe in. We've seen this disinformation, particularly when it comes to some of the well-known organizations like the White Helmets, our volunteer rescue workers who go into the rubble and save Syrians, from under the rubble of airstrikes and other weaponry. And it became evident once Russia intervened in the conflict that these people were photographing the aftermath of Russian airstrikes, and as a consequence, building up the case for the war crimes or the crimes against humanity that were occurring, and the civilian deaths that were that can be directly attributed to the Russians. And what followed from that was a massive disinformation campaign that the Guardian at the time had peeled away the layers behind it and identified some of the Russian bot networks that were spreading disinformation about the White Helmets specifically. But that's only one aspect of the broader disinformation that you see whenever you're covering any aspect of the conflict. From the regular folks sort of commenting on Twitter and saying, you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know what's actually happening because you're not on the ground, to the broader, more organized or more systematic disinformation efforts that you see, and that are often traced back to pro-regime troll networks and Russian troll networks on social media outlets, as well as their boosters among the pro-Assad commentariat and media personnel in the West. And I think, to be honest, that the scrutiny on the reporting on Syria is actually a good thing, because it forced a lot of journalists to examine the ways that they report on the conflict, to ensure that the information that they are putting out there to the public is vetted and is as accurate a picture of reality as could be under the circumstances. And that meant that the reporting that has been published on Syria, for the most part, has been quite solid as a result of this additional scrutiny. You have to be able to defend what you publish, and with so many people on your back about whether you got various details right or not, you're forced into that method of operating, where you only report on information that you can back up, and that you have confirmed through trusted sources that aren't in contact with each other, in ways that are very similar to the way investigative journalists verify information and try to identify what is in the information that they can actually include in their stories or not. So it has had a good overall impact on the way journalists do their job. Unfortunately, it also has the side effect of if you're somebody who wants to just read about what's going on in Syria, you're better off obviously reading the mainstream media outlets. But if you're on social media, you have to sift through enormous quantities of noise before you actually get to the signal. If you're an outside observer just trying to find out what's going on in the country.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. So on that, actually, on an episode of the Beirut Banyan podcast, which I will link in the show notes, you reflected a bit on this feeling that journalism, including critical and investigative journalism, which is the kind of journalism that you do, of course, doesn't always produce concrete results, in the sense that justice isn't necessarily done. There's very rarely accountability, especially in a context like Syria. I admit I did talk about this a bit online. You've reflected on it, on Twitter and elsewhere as well. I admit feeling like this quite a bit, even to the point where it led me last year to pretty much quit Global Voices and IFAX, which is where I used to work there. I used to work there as an editor for the Middle East and North Africa region, largely because it just felt like I had gotten to the point where, I guess burnout would be the term for it. I don't think there's a better term for it, unfortunately. How have you managed to, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, obviously, but how have you managed to navigate those feelings, and I'm not going to ask you for tips on how to get out of it, because I think for many reasons that would be very, very difficult to do. But yes, I guess I'm just asking you for general reflections on that note, because it's definitely something that I've seen a lot, primarily on Syria, because that's the country I focused on the most in recent years, but it's definitely not limited only to Syria, of course.
Wow, I really hope I had nothing to do with getting you to quit journalism.
No, you didn't.
It's a really difficult thing to contemplate, right? I suppose the disconnect happens because, for the reason many people actually become journalists, which is, to help make the world a better place. I got into journalism because I wanted to tell traumatic stories for people who, didn't get a chance to tell their stories. When I was in college, we had a journalist from the New York Times come and speak to us about covering the war in Lebanon in 2006, and he told us a story about going to a sort of a mass funeral service or mass memorial service for a number of victims of the war, And he met there a man. He struck up a conversation with him, and after some time asked him what he was doing there that day, and he said that he had buried his wife and his daughter earlier that day. And that story really struck with me. I think I knew right away when I heard that story that I wanted to be a journalist who is able to tell those stories, who brings those stories to light, to kind of inform more people of the suffering that happens. And also because journalism is this fascinating job where you get to just, go around talking to people who are much smarter than you, or, people who have more interesting life stories than you. And you just get to listen to them tell you what happened. And then, through the platform of, the international media or prominent media organization, you can spread that story far and wide. I think the expectation is, though, when you sort of look back at a body of work, Josie Ensor from the Telegraph recently wrote about this, as she was leaving her job as a Middle East correspondent for the newspaper and I think moving to the US. She talked about looking back at a body of work and realizing that it didn't quite matter because, you went on writing about what was going on in Syria for years, and the lot of Syrians did not improve. So as far as the people who were talking to you were concerned, their lives didn't get measurably better by sharing their stories with you. And the thing that can be difficult is to think, okay, well, a conflict like Syria was so well documented by the international media, but nevertheless, that did not prompt any any sort of real result on the ground as to the well-being of the Syrians who were suffering and whose suffering we wrote about extensively. So then are you really supposed to be disappointed by the lack of results, or are you supposed to simply take satisfaction in the fact that you helped write that first draft of history, and that maybe in some future date it's going to matter, but like in the intervening time it doesn't really quite matter, or it hasn't had any significant impact. I think it's a flaw in the way we think. To think to ourselves that we matter enough that our coverage ought to move the needle somehow, even if we're talking about the collective impact of journalists. Because our job is not to be activists, right? Our job is to sort of tell the truth or as close to the truth as we can muster, and then our job kind of ends there. And the desire to make the world a better place is not. I think if you have that as a journalist, you're going to be somewhat disappointed in the end result. But it's not an avoidable fallacy, because when you become a journalist as a young person, your hope is to make the world a better place. And then as you sort of spend more time in the milieu of reporting and journalism, you realize that making the world a better place doesn't just depend on people knowing what happened or knowing the truth. It is disappointing in the sense that, when you contemplate the great evil events that happened over the course of the past century, like the Holocaust, like the genocide in Rwanda, like the wars of the former Yugoslavia, and other similar atrocities that occurred over the course of the last century, you do realize that the promises that we made about what humanity ought to be like and what it ought to aspire to are just empty promises. They're not based on any actual process that is going to implement these limits that we place on what is acceptable civilized behavior in the world. And this is certainly not just applicable, in the case of Syria. It's applicable in the case of other international powers that intervene in the region and and are never held accountable for what they've done. But that's the thing that this realization that when we said never again, we didn't really mean it. And that's much more profoundly disappointing in humanity as a whole, as opposed to being a flaw in journalism as a profession or as a calling. It's this disappointment in humanity that is the outcome of these years of reporting on Syria, as opposed to a belief that journalism is not something useful. It's not a useful vocation. Just because just because the reporting did not lead to tangible results on the ground.
Oh, for sure. And just so that I make it clear, in case there are listeners who were confused by my comment before, I don't encourage anyone to quit. It's nothing that. It was just let's call it a temporary decision that I made just because it became a bit too much at the time. And I hope that basically this podcast and other stuff is a way of compensating for that, because so what I did sometimes was journalism. The rest of the time was, I would say, more in the op-ed world, and obviously as an editor I was more responsible for getting journalists rather than doing journalism myself. But the reflections that I'm trying to get out, and thanks a lot for this answer. You wrote at the end of 2019, I believe, like 4 days before the first case of COVID-19 was officially announced. You published a pretty powerful piece on BuzzFeed, which obviously I will also link, reflecting on what you called a nightmare decade for the Arab and Muslim worlds. Obviously, you gave
such an innocent time.
Such an innocent time before COVID-19. Obviously, the examples that you gave, in the two most populous countries, India and China. You have the dehumanization and demonization of Muslims have reached such levels that we're seeing literal pogroms in India and these so-called re-education camps in China. Obviously, we can think of the Rohingya in Myanmar, Turkey, Egypt's authoritarian terms, the Saudi war on Yemen, Bahrain's repression of protesters, the role of Iran in the region, how many governments are participating right now in Libya. I've actually personally lost track. And so many different things that have happened literally in the past decade. Of course, we can go further back. We can speak of the invasion of Iraq. We can speak of the post-2003 landscape, even going back to the 90s and the wars of in the former Yugoslavia. There are, we can start wherever we want to start, I guess. But it's definitely the case that this past decade has been one of difficulties, like, to put it very, very mildly. At the same time, and that was in December, you wrote of the things that are making you feel a bit of hope for the world that your son, who you mentioned is going to be 1 year old very soon, the world that he was born into. Can you talk a bit about that? Like, how do you... Because, let's be honest, it's not often that we associate Muslim world or Arab world with hope, unfortunately. Can you reflect a bit on this, and what are some of some of the ways that you see this kind of hope being kindled, in a sense?
Oh wow, that's a tough question in this in this specific moment in time as well.
I know, sorry.
Right. Let's take a step back for a second. I think one aspect we forget is that we will endure. We will get through this as we did through various other crises that we seem to be lurching from one after the other. It doesn't escape me the fact that we are, we're raising a baby in a moment in time where, things are so uncertain, where, if things go on the way they are, when he grows up, he's going to have to, deal with the consequences of our inaction on climate change, entrenched at the moment, authoritarian, totalitarian political systems in the Middle East. We've really ceded a lot of the physical spaces, for self-expression, and that's why we're all congregating online now. to be able to have the conversations, about the shapes of our societies, whether now in the aftermath of COVID-19 or, the conversations we're having before that, because we couldn't go out to the streets and protest, save for a few exceptions like in Lebanon, and before that, Algeria and Iraq and Sudan in recent months. I think there are causes for hope, and I'll get into that in a second. I do think that that one of the things that I feel are really important as somebody coming from the Middle East, to be able to instill in him, and that is anathema to most of our to how we lead our lives there when we live in the Middle East, is the value of human life. There's it's quite staggering today to obviously look at the figures that are coming out about the deaths and the cases of COVID-19 as it sort of spreads like wildfire around the world. I think we just crossed 2 million cases globally, and and tens of thousands of deaths. And these numbers are numbers that we're familiar with from having covered Syria for nearly a decade now. Syria has been going on obviously for over 9 years, and 500,000 people have been killed, probably much more than that. And something over than 10 million people have been displaced. The numbers are obviously really staggering. But the important thing is that behind every one of those numbers was a story. Every one of these people had dreams, had loved ones, had people that they cared about, maybe they had a school, maybe they had a favorite toy, maybe they had some special friends that they can no longer get to see because of conflict, and we lose sight of that in the course of the war. Before we immigrated to Canada, I spent a long time really contemplating the move and whether it was the right thing to do, because our entire lives were in the Middle East, and our entire social networks were there, our entire families were there, and but what very clearly emerged over the course of my work as a reporter was the fact that human life has almost no value to our leaders, and even to ourselves as ordinary folks. We've become so accustomed to loss of life, throughout the course of all these conflicts, that loss of life has become an abstract concept to us. And I remember the conversations we were having in the back in January when the U.S. assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, which seems like it happened 10 years ago now. There were all these discussions about the risk of causing flare-ups in the region and further violence, and which was clearly being made by people who had no idea what was going on in the Middle East, because obviously the Middle East had been suffering from chronic violence for years. When we went to when I went to Khan Sheykoun, we had this conversation with one of the militiamen who was in the car with me while we were on the way to the town. And he was making a joke saying, that maybe they ought to kidnap me and ransom me instead of taking me to the site of the attack, because it was going to be more worth their while. And I made the joke that I'm Egyptian, nobody was going to pay for me to. And everybody laughed, but behind that was a fundamental truth that our lives are not worth that much. But what I see now is these conversations that are happening across the region about reform, about wanting to change some fundamental realities in our part of the world, which unfortunately have been have had to put the brakes on because of the coronavirus pandemic. But a lot of these conversations were about dignity, about the value of human life, about all of these elements that make society sound. And I think what's going to end up happening in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic is, these countries that, there's a New York Times piece that was talking about how it's impossible, how the coronavirus is an enemy that's impossible to arrest. Authoritarian leaders in the Middle East cannot simply arrest the virus. And so, those countries that fail to deal with the pandemic in the appropriate way, and, the likelihood is that a lot of our governments and leaders have, for years been hollowing out these state institutions that are supposed to serve the people, like the police, like the various security services, like the health system, like the education system. And I think after the pandemic is over, there's going to be a reckoning, because people are going to realize that they were not served well by these leaders who claimed that they would be there to protect the people. And so that's a very roundabout way of saying that that I'm perhaps a little bit less optimistic than I was at the end of the year, given all the current upheaval that we're going through. And it's going to be really difficult to predict what the coming years will look like in our part of the world. But I do think that the important values to raise our children with, in at this very uncertain time, is for them to, take a moment to reflect and realize that everybody's life has value, that there is inherent value to every life around them, that everybody has their own story that deserves to be heard and told. And that's, I think that the root of that is going to solve a lot of the problems that we have in otherizing one another and failing to listen to everyone's fears and insecurities.
On the when you were talking, I was thinking about whether to describe myself as an optimist or a pessimist, and there is this word that I quite like, which I think is from the English translation of a Palestinian novel. The title actually escapes me now, but the term is a pesoptimist. So someone who's both pessimistic and optimistic at the same time, or according to one of the more ironically more optimistic interpretations, it's having pessimistic expectations in a sense, but I'm butchering how to explain it, obviously, but like your expectations are pessimistic simply because the facts around you point towards that conclusion, but at the same time you basically try your best in a more hopeful manner, and in the hope that this at least nudges things in the right direction. And I do fundamentally believe that. I don't despite everything we've seen from Palestine to Syria to Libya to Yemen, and all of the countries in between, and obviously beyond. This is not just a Middle East and North African issue, although that's what we focus on. It does always seem that within crises, as cliche as that sounds, there are sometimes opportunities, and we simply have no idea what quote unquote opportunities might come out of the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, this is a topic that I'm gonna hope to explore in the context of Lebanon with other guests, hopefully in the coming month or two.
Yeah, I can get behind that viewpoint. It's something that you just tend to struggle with, and if you feel that that you ought to that your view on the world is dependent on how the world is, as opposed to the things that you can control, which is your own reaction to events as opposed to the events themselves. You're going to have a lot of trouble otherwise acclimatizing to the realities of the world around you.
On a final-ish note, depending on how we take this, I'm very curious about your thoughts on. Well, you mentioned it a bit, so you can expand on it as much as you want. But you're someone who has moved a lot. I think you were based in the Gulf. Was it Abu Dhabi, I think, before?
Yeah, I grew up in Dubai and worked in Abu Dhabi there, and worked in Abu Dhabi for the national in the UAE.
Okay, so you were based in the UAE, and then you're originally from Egypt, from Alexandria, I believe, and you were based in Beirut when you were working on Syria and the wider Middle East for The Guardian, and now you're in Montreal. Myself, in the past, what is it now, 4 years and a half. I'm currently in my fourth city. As it just happens, this wasn't really planned, and this kind of not necessarily forced movement, but not necessarily my first choice either most of the time, has definitely given me a different perspective on the very sharp contrast that we're all having to, seemingly the whole planet, or at least a significant chunk of the planet, has to go through right now with the COVID-19 crisis, which is basically the literal opposite. Everyone stay at home, reduce movement as much as you can. Obviously, not everyone can do that, but that's the general idea. And, the whole notion of moving is, in any case, kind of not being put into question or anything like that, but at least frozen for the time being, or slowed down for the time being. I'd be very curious as to your and this is a question I think I'm gonna ask as many, most guests probably, like how they have been. So I'll just ask it to you directly. How have you experienced, the COVID-19 crisis, I guess, in the past few months now? What are some things that it has forced you, in a sense, to maybe re-question or reflect upon? In any case, I don't think everyone's gonna come out of this with some kind of enlightenment or anything like this. It's just, it definitely seems that if it does nothing else, and here we're obviously talking about those of us who thankfully have not gotten it or have not suffered from it for the time being, and hopefully never. It's forcing kind of types of reflections that maybe we wouldn't have had otherwise. Does that make sense? I don't know if I made any sense right now.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. Well, I mean, so the fact of the matter is, so here in Canada, we don't have a full lockdown in the sense that, like the hardest hit parts of the world where, you have to like get a permit before you go to do some grocery shopping. There's no curfew. There's no draconian lockdown, and it seems like the social distancing measures have worked, sort of, because it seems like in Montreal anyway, we're supposed to be hitting the peak sometime this week, and I think Quebec as a province is supposed to do the same next week. And it's really been quite enlightening to, given just the proximity to the U.S., just the great disparity in the way, the government has sort of dealt with the crisis there compared to in the U.S. Because there seems to be like this focus in Canada on on just the human suffering aspect of it, and how we need to help all these people who are out of a job or are losing their income. There's this focus on let's alleviate human suffering as much as we can, and that extends obviously to people at their lost their jobs and whatnot, as opposed to in the States the focus on we want to get back to work before Easter, or we want to make sure that like capitalism prevails, that the country doesn't shut down long enough that God forbid we lose some money in the quest to eternal growth, as opposed to just sort of like take it slow for a little bit until things stabilize. It's just quite extraordinary to me, the conversations that are taking place in the U.S. Around the cost benefit analysis of whether it's worth sacrificing a few thousand citizens in order to reopen the economy, when you would have thought that the mark of a civilized society is that it protects life as much as it can, and the right to life as much as it can. But that said, I always thought that it's so strange to have to contend with the cult of productivity, where like you have to learn, you have to kind of like emerge out of this having mastered the new hobby and learned the new language, and lost 15 pounds. I think I've already gained quite a few pounds. I am taking some French classes online, so I am doing that. I'm really privileged. Look, I think I'm extremely lucky to be going through this crisis in Canada, where things are relatively easy to get, where life is quite comfortable, where there's this where the crisis hasn't been particularly pronounced, where there's a focus on helping ordinary folks survive through the crisis, and also, like, I haven't lost my job. I'm still. I write satire on a daily basis nowadays, and it's actually been a huge boost that helps me kind of deal with the with the crappiness of having to follow the news and what's been going on. I mean, we're like today we did a piece on how in the Arab world the leaders in the Arab world are going to have to use the coronavirus time wisely, because they now have an excuse to lock everyone up, and they're going to have to figure out a new a new sort of modus operandi with the people once they get back on the street, and they realize that security and stability are no longer viable ways of keeping people in check after the pandemic. It's I've been lucky to be able to keep my job and to be able to continue working from home. A lot of other people are not so lucky, and so I've gotten through somewhat unscathed. I will say two things though. One is that it really brings to you the cost of the true cost of being an immigrant. The fact is that I can't go check on my on my mother. I can't be with my family. And a lot of us can't be, but they're just so much farther away, and it's harder to access that fount of stability and comfort and love when you're forced to be so far away from your loved ones. The costs of being an immigrant. I think nowadays, when you're not talking about the bigger aspects, of resurgent populism and discrimination and whatnot, when you're not talking about that, a lot of the costs of being an immigrant often shines through in those little things. The missed birthdays, the missed weddings, the funerals that you couldn't make it to, the phone calls that grow farther and farther apart, just not being able to hold your parents' hand or or embrace them. I think all of those little things add up to being something that's extraordinarily painful and is a true sacrifice, I think, just by the very fact of being an immigrant, and these are all amplified by what happens during a pandemic like this, where no matter what happens, you're extremely far away from the people that you love. The other thing is that it forces you to rethink, the idea about how essential you are to society. Really, it's hard to sit at home and basically think that, okay, well, my job now is to simply just stay on my ass and watch Netflix. When the sacrifices are being borne by a very small percentage of incredibly brave members of society who have dedicated their lives to taking care of us and to keeping us healthy and well, and to be there in our direst moments of need, and it can feel really privileged to just have to stay at home and just help through inaction. It can feel like it's not really useful, but it also forces you to think, well, society can pretty much go on existing without my contribution, and how valuable is my contribution really to society? But there was I think there's a tweet by Stephen King a few days ago, in which he, I think, I forget if it was either he had said it or if he had, retweeted it from someone else. But it basically said that, if you're asking yourself what the value of artists and creative folks is to society, then imagine sitting during the pandemic and not having anything to do, to read or to watch or to listen to. And so these moments I vacillate between both sides of the equation, where I sit there and contemplate how useless I am to to society more broadly, because I spend my life making right now I spend my days making jokes about Arab leaders, and what use is that to anyone really? As opposed to a doctor or a delivery person or someone at the grocery store, who are all like making the world go round at this moment in time, or the person picking up the garbage on every day from the homes and streets. How useful am I really? But then you also realize that we all really have a part to play, and we're all part of that greater cog, and I do hope that when we come out of it, we'll grow more appreciative of our fellow human beings, and of the value that they bring, and of the stories that they have and that they can tell, because ultimately, if you need to run to the hospital, or to self-isolate, or if you're old and you need somebody to pick up the groceries for you, or if you have kids that you need to take care of in the middle of the pandemic, but you desperately need to buy some milk or formula or diapers. It doesn't really matter if your neighbor is Shia or Sunni or Christian. If they're conservative or liberal, they're progressive or libertarian. None of that matters ultimately, because ultimately, we're all in it together, and I hope we see more of that once the crisis is over, and we take those values to heart, because our discourse has grown to be incredibly poisonous over the last few years, whether in the Middle East or in the world more broadly. And I hope we can take this moment once things settle down to reflect and to realize that we're all in it together, ultimately.
Well, amen to that. Kareem, thanks a lot for your time. Is there anything that you wanted us to talk about, or that just crossed your mind, or something that but we didn't have time to get to?
I don't think so. I mean, I will just add a point to the question that you had asked earlier about the value of doing journalism. I remember during the siege of Aleppo, when we were constantly talking to local doctors and nurses and activists on the ground who were kind of in this shrinking piece of territory. We obviously couldn't get direct access to them because the eastern half of the city, which was under rebel control, was under a total lockdown and siege. In the course of the conflict, the regime, as it was winning, the area or the piece of territory that those people were living in, kept getting smaller and smaller, and they kept having to flee. And so, we had a lot of conversations with them in which, we didn't know if we were going to, if they were still going to be alive, or, they're going to be able to continue talking to us once the conflict was over, or like in the intervening days as it progressed. Sometimes I was in a WhatsApp group with some doctors and international journalists, and sometimes you just get this overflow of frustration from the people on the ground. There was this nurse who said, who took out her frustration because she said that she didn't see the point of talking to us, because their suffering was continuing anyway, despite everything that was being reported, and despite the interviews, and they were spending time talking to all these strangers and reporters, and nothing was really coming out of it. And so eventually, eventually she would calm down and would resume having these conversations. But it struck me at the time that there is that people sometimes just want to be heard, and that there is value in letting them unload the heavy burden that they have. Because I think I think most of the people who talk to you know that the chances that an individual story or an individual conversation with a journalist is going to change much in their reality is quite minuscule. And people talk to you despite that. And so I think even as we sort of lose hope in the value of journalism, if we do, or we forget why we entered the profession in the first place, because the world doesn't seem to be getting better. I think it's worth remembering the fact that it's not just about us; it's about the debt we owe to all those people who, talk to us at moments of extreme vulnerability in their lives, and they take the time to share, their most painful moments and the most extreme suffering that they've endured, and take the time to share it with journalists. I think that ought to be reason enough to keep us going and to keep us telling their stories.
I think that's an excellent note to end on. Kareem, thanks a lot for your time. This was an excellent conversation. I really appreciated it.
Thank you, Joey. It's a pleasure, and I have great admiration and respect for the work that you do, and for and for the commentary and insights that you bring to the region's politics and to broader political movements in the Arab world as well as beyond. And I always get a kick out of following you on Twitter and following all the arguments and fights you get into, and so please keep at it. We need more people with your energy and relentless drive to argue for what is right, so keep on doing what you're doing.
Thanks a lot, Kareem.
Thank you.